Most people remember Theodore Roosevelt as a man made of momentum. He survives in American memory as the president who made power look virtuous, the Rough Rider, the trust buster, the hunter, the reformer who turned the presidency into something louder and more forceful than it had been before. He has been preserved as the face of national confidence at the moment the United States was discovering how large it wanted to be. But that polished image hides the darker core of his presidency. Theodore Roosevelt did not leave behind a scandal in the ordinary sense. There was no private disgrace waiting in the shadows, no financial fraud, no secret affair that shattered the myth from within. His scandal was larger than that. It sat at the level of state power. It asked what happens when a leader becomes so certain of his country's destiny that another nation's sovereignty begins to look less like a limit and more like an inconvenience. That is why Panama matters. The Panama Canal is usually remembered as one of the great engineering achievements of the modern age, and in practical terms it was. It transformed global shipping, increased American naval flexibility, and became one of the great monuments of 20th century statecraft. Roosevelt understood that. He also understood something politically useful. Once the canal existed, once ships were moving through it, the argument over how it had been obtained would start to feel old and technical. Progress would become its own defense. That is what makes the story darker. Before the canal was a triumph, it was a contest over whether the United States could help break a peace off Colombia, secure treaty rights from the newborn state of Panama, and then present the entire sequence not as coercion, but as necessity. Roosevelt entered office in 1901 after the assassination of William McKinley and quickly redefined the presidency as an engine of action. At 42, he was the youngest president in American history at that point, and he brought with him more than energy. He believed the office should shape events, not wait for them. He believed national greatness required motion, will, and confrontation. That instinct helped make him popular. It also made him dangerous in the way charismatic state builders often are. When they succeed, their methods start to look less like choices and more like proof of their own necessity. By the early 20th century, the United States was emerging from the Spanish-American War with overseas ambitions more openly displayed. Roosevelt did not merely serve that moment. He gave it a personality. And in Panama, that personality became policy. The real question is not whether Roosevelt wanted the canal. Of course he did. The question is whether he believed that desire, backed by American power, was enough to reorder events until legality caught up later. That was the scandal. Not the canal alone, but the method by which power made the canal possible. Roosevelt's attraction to the canal grew out of a worldview that linked commerce, military readiness, prestige, and masculine will into one political language. Long before he reached the White House, American strategists had dreamed of a passage connecting the Atlantic and Pacific. The Spanish-American War made that dream feel urgent. Naval operations exposed how difficult it was to move ships efficiently between oceans, so the canal became more than a convenience. It became a symbol of what a rising power should be able to build, control, and defend. Roosevelt embraced that logic instinctively because it matched the way he already thought about civilization itself. In his imagination, vigorous nations expanded, organized, and imposed order. Weak nations hesitated or stood in the path of stronger ones. At first, the legal path seemed simple. Congress favored the Panama route in 1902. Negotiations with Colombia produced the High-Heran Treaty in 1903, which would have granted the United States rights to build the canal through territory that was still part of Colombia. But the Colombian Senate refused to ratify it, judging the terms too favorable to Washington and too dismissive of Colombian sovereignty. That rejection is where Roosevelt's legend and Roosevelt's scandal begin to merge. A more cautious president might have reopened negotiations, offered more money, waited, or shifted toward Nicaragua. Roosevelt did not want delay. Delay threatened the whole mood of the enterprise. It threatened the story he wanted the United States to tell about itself, that it was a nation built not to plead with obstacles, but to overcome them. Once that mindset takes hold, another country's refusal stops looking like a lawful decision and starts looking like an obstruction against history. Roosevelt's broader policy style helps explain what happened next. Official U.S. historical summaries later described his approach to Latin America and the Caribbean as assertive and linked it to what became known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The logic was plain. The United States would assume a larger supervisory role in the hemisphere and could use force to defend its interests or preempt outside influence. Even when force was not directly used, the shadow of American power mattered. Panama would become the clearest demonstration of this method. Roosevelt did not need to announce conquest. He only needed conditions in which American desire, local unrest, naval presence, and diplomatic speed could combine into a new political fact. He understood tempo. He understood that if you moved quickly enough, many people would stop asking whether you had the right to move at all. Behind the language of progress stood a simpler conviction. The United States was too important to have its strategic future blocked by Colombian refusal. Once that conviction hardened, scandal no longer looked like scandal from inside Roosevelt's mind. It looked like efficiency. It looked like destiny correcting paperwork. What changed everything was the speed with which diplomacy turned into geopolitical choreography. In November 1903, after the Colombian Senate had rejected the Canal Treaty, Panamanian separatists moved toward revolt. Panama had a history of separatist sentiment, so the desire for independence was not invented from nothing. But the question has never been whether local discontent existed. The question is what Roosevelt did with that opening. The United States sent naval forces to the area, limiting Colombia's ability to suppress the rebellion. Panama declared independence on November 3, 1903. The United States recognized the new republic within days. Diplomatic relations were established on November 13th, when Roosevelt accepted the credentials of Philippe Bunau-Varilla as Panama's minister to the United States. Then, on November 18th, the Bunau-Varilla Treaty was signed, granting the United States sweeping rights to a canal zone across the isthmus. Laid out in sequence, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Colombia said no. A secession succeeded under American protection. Recognition came almost immediately. A treaty followed with remarkable speed. The canal that could not be secured from Colombia was now secured from a state born in the middle of the crisis. The most unsettling figure in this episode is Bunau-Varilla, because he reveals how empire can hide inside paperwork. Official U.S. historical accounts note that he entered negotiations without formal consent from the Panamanian government and had not lived in Panama for 17 years. Yet this was the man negotiating the treaty that would define one of the most important strategic spaces in the hemisphere. He was not a neutral vessel of Panamanian self-determination. He was an operator inside a moment that rewarded speed over legitimacy. This strips away the clean version of the story in which a new nation simply exercised sovereignty and welcomed American partnership. The legal shell existed, but the moral basis was shakier. Panama achieved independence, yes, but under circumstances in which the strongest outside actor had every reason to ensure that independence took a form immediately useful to Washington. Roosevelt's defenders have long argued that he was dealing with a difficult Colombian government and that the canal served global trade and navigation. Those arguments help explain why he remains defensible to many admirers, but they do not erase the structure of the event. Even if one grants that Panama had real separatist energy, the episode still raises a brutal question. When a stronger nation arranges conditions in which a weaker one cannot practically resist, does the later treaty prove consent or merely formalize the result of pressure? Roosevelt did not need to invade Colombia outright. He only needed the right alignment of unrest, naval deterrence, recognition, and treaty-making. The genius of the mechanism was that it created a finished legal reality faster than criticism could stop it. By the time moral objections fully formed, the new republic already existed, the treaty was signed, and the canal project had the appearance of lawful permanence. That was Roosevelt's scandal. He helped turn pressure into paperwork, and paperwork into destiny. And yet Panama did not damage Roosevelt in the way later generations might expect. He was not politically buried by the affair. He was enlarged by it. The canal became evidence of his effectiveness, not his excess. Instead of treating the episode as morally awkward, Roosevelt folded it into the legend of executive vigor. In 1906, he traveled to Panama, becoming the first sitting American president to leave the country while in office. The visit mattered symbolically as much as politically. Roosevelt placed himself inside the construction zone, surrounded by machines, mud, and excavation, and transformed the canal from a contested geopolitical act into a spectacle of purposeful labor. He stood on a digging machine and let the image speak. The message was simple. Whatever the arguments over 1903, history was moving now, and he was the man moving it. That visual language was enormously powerful because it converted controversy into visible achievement. It is hard for many publics to keep moral outrage alive once engineering gives an enterprise the appearance of destiny fulfilled. This is where Roosevelt's political brilliance merges with the darker lesson of the scandal. He understood that monuments are built not only in stone and concrete, but in narrative. If the canal could be remembered as one of the great works of modern civilization, then the awkward birth of the canal zone could be recast as merely the rough opening chapter of a necessary project. The canal's usefulness became an argument in itself. Roosevelt's broader hemispheric doctrine helps explain why he never saw Panama as disqualifying. The Roosevelt corollary normalized the idea that the United States could intervene, supervise, or preempt in the name of stability and order. Panama was not a bizarre exception to that outlook. It was one of its purest expressions. The United States would identify a strategic objective, judge regional conditions through the lens of its own interests, and then act with a confidence that blurred the line between guardianship and dominance. The canal, therefore, was not simply about transportation. It was about who had the authority to define order in the Americas. Roosevelt answered that question with action before he answered it with argument. But scandal does not need to destroy a man to reveal him. Sometimes the deeper scandal is that it leaves the hero intact. Roosevelt remained admired because he fit a national hunger for forceful leadership at a moment of expansion. Many Americans preferred the story of the builder to the story of the manipulator because the builder made them feel strong. That is the moral convenience of empire in its confident phase. It lets the public experience domination as competence. Roosevelt's image as reformer and energetic statesman was not false. That is what makes the contradiction harder, not easier. He could genuinely expand the role of the federal government at home while also helping normalize coercive power abroad. Panama did not cancel Roosevelt's greatness. It complicated what that greatness meant. The canal opened in 1914 after Roosevelt had left office, and its completion seemed to vindicate everything his admirers had claimed about him. The waterway shortened routes, transformed maritime strategy, and stood as a monumental demonstration of American reach. But legacies shaped by power do not stay settled forever. The original arrangement created a canal zone under permanent U.S. rights, and that permanence itself became a source of resentment. Official State Department history later acknowledged that American control of the canal zone became an irritant in relations with Panama, and that many Panamanians questioned the validity of the Bunau-Varilla Treaty from the beginning. In other words, the canal's success did not erase the wound beneath it. It merely made that wound easier for outsiders to ignore for a time. The issue with Colombia also lingered. In 1914, a treaty was signed between the United States and Colombia for the settlement of differences arising out of the events on the Isthmus of Panama in November 1903. That document matters because it quietly exposes the limits of Roosevelt's own narrative. If the whole affair had truly been beyond reproach, there would have been no need for a later diplomatic settlement framed in those terms. The existence of that treaty is a reminder that the controversy did not simply fade into unanimous acceptance. It had to be managed. It had to be repaired at least partly by a later administration. That does not mean history reached a final moral verdict against Roosevelt. But it does show that even governments benefiting from the canal understood that the origin story remained troublesome enough to require formal accommodation. And that returns us to the central contradiction of Theodore Roosevelt. He is remembered as a builder of the modern presidency, and rightly so. He expanded public expectations of executive leadership and embodied a new style of national confidence. He is also remembered for reform, conservation, and charisma so vivid that it can still overpower the darker chapters of his record. But Panama forces a harsher reading. It suggests that Roosevelt's greatness cannot be separated from a willingness to treat American power as morally self-justifying. He did not simply believe the United States was strong. He believed strength conferred a special right to act. Once that principle is accepted, treaties can become tools for locking in outcomes that were made possible by pressure in the first place. Most people still meet Theodore Roosevelt first through the myth, the writer, the reformer, the man of the strenuous life. But the darker Roosevelt appears when you stop asking what he built and start asking what forms of power he normalized while building it. Panama was not merely an engineering dream fulfilled. It was a demonstration that a confident empire could intervene, legalize the outcome, and then invite the world to admire the structure rather than the rupture that produced it. That is why the scandal endures. Not because Roosevelt fell from grace, but because he did not. He remained the hero while the method survived behind him. The canal made him look like a master builder of modern America. It also left behind a question that still belongs to every age of great power politics. When a mighty state calls something progress, who gets to decide whether it was progress and who is expected to live with the consequences after the monument is complete? Theodore Roosevelt's shadow begins there, not in hidden vice, but in visible power, so confident that it expected history to remember the canal and forget the way the border changed before the first ship ever passed through.